Weapon deep dives are an intellectual pursuit, our attempt at further understanding the true meta of Destiny 2's weapon sandbox. We discover the true power of Leviathan's breath, the disappointing story behind Revision Zero, and the fascinating inner workings of Forerunner. Today though, our tale is of a weapon you may know quite well, for better or for worse, for it has surely seen both bad and good times. Fellas, we're living in the good times. And that weapon we're going to be talking about is none other than Wishender. For months now, it has risen to the top of every in-game meta conversation. Now, we're not here to dispute the exotic bow's reputation, but instead we want to ask the question, why is it so good? And is it going to get better? Now, Wishender may be old news for some of you, but there are plenty of players old and new that have yet to even get their hands on it. It was added to the game with Forsaken back in 2018, which also introduced the combat bow weapon type altogether. And the means of acquiring it are the same, basically at least. Now, to begin your journey, you'll need to purchase the Forsaken pack, Bungie's solution for keeping all of its Dreaming City content in the game after sunsetting most of Forsaken, and the Wishender quest can be picked up by speaking to the Ido statue in the Shattered Throne dungeon, or acquired from the quest archive kiosk in the tower. Now, this quest is full of steps that will send you all over the dungeon performing extra challenges, but don't let that deter you. The Shattered Throne is over 4 years old, and my god, we have so much power creep in the game, you'll be just fine. But again, this is a deep dive of the weapon, not the quest. We'll link a guide down below for those of you that do not have Wishender, but with that being said, let's dive in. Now, I don't know if y'all remember, guys, Wishender when it first came out, at least initially via the trailers, everybody was hyped about this bow. It looked amazing. However, for me, it fell flat. So much so it's more of a novelty weapon with little to no use. And it's taken nearly 4 years into Wishender's life to finally have Bungie do something about this exotic. That polish came in Season the Plunder. Now, specifically, Bungie gave it anti-barrier rounds, or I guess in this case, anti-barrier arrows, as well as improved penetration damage. Now, there was a lot of people still skeptical, but quickly we found that it was outperforming even the likes of Arbalest. Come Grandmaster time, you started to quickly see people using Wishender in all of their loadouts. Now, by and large, Wishender performs like other bows in the game. Instead of a range stat, it has accuracy, and it deals consistent damage at all ranges. However, distant targets are of course harder to hit because you're shooting a projectile, which drops lower the further that it travels. Now, bows also have multiple tiers of damage that today we're going to be breaking down into 3 categories. Short draw is the damage dealt when tapping the trigger, firing the arrow immediately without drawing it at all. Perfect draw is the damage dealt during a short window after the arrow is fully drawn and the hardest hitting of the 3. Full draw is the damage dealt after the perfect draw window, and of course is slightly lower as a result, but still far higher than of course the short draw. Now, in Wishender's base ornaments and with the default color settings, you see this purplish glow which fills the etchings on its upper razor as the arrow is being drawn back. Now, testing at 60 frames per second, it takes on average 53 frames or approximately 0.83 seconds to reach that perfect draw, which you can verify by the weapon's glow reaching the hilt of a sword that's etched into the bow. It's a beautiful design, guys. After another 45 frames or so, that glow recedes back down the bow. Now, once the sword hilt is no longer lit up, we're out of that perfect draw, and any arrow now released will now do full draw damage. Now, of course, you can work around this if you're utilizing Oathkeepers, which allows you to hold that perfect draw at all times. Oathkeepers also shaves off around 6 frames off of that draw speed, among other benefits, which we're going to be seeing next season. More on that in just a bit. Now, unique to Wishender are its traits. High tension bowstring, which provides greater accuracy than other bows at the cost of slower draw time. You also have anti-taken fletching, which does 10% extra damage to taken enemies. Now, the true shining star here, though, is Broadhead and Queen's Wrath. Broadhead causes additional damage on entry and exit of certain targets and penetrating through a target entirely to hit more than one at a time. And Queen's Wrath is essentially free wall hacks. Now, while aiming down sights with a fully drawn bow, combatants behind walls will be highlighted. And this intrinsic perk also includes anti-barrier functionality. Now, this gives us a lot of numbers to keep track of, not just for Wishender, but for its competition. So we're gonna do our best here to try to keep this all digestible. But let's start with red bar enemies. At Carl, Wishender's perfect draw hits these miners at 15,728 per body and 28,217 per precision hit. A full draw, which is the point past that perfect draw, comes in about 2.4% lower at these values. And of course, the short draw, which is just immediately firing, lands us at 13,000 7,246 per body and 23,764 per crit, approximately an 18% drop in damage. Now regarding penetration, all three draw types work the same. All enemies in the path of the arrow will take the full damage for that draw, crit, body, entry, and exit. Broadhead puts in work. Now against majors, perfect draw hits 7,415 per body and 13,303 per crit. And we finally see Broadhead's effects too, adding extra entry and exit damage of 14,065. Full draw arrows hit for 7,240 per body and 12,989 per crit, with 2 Broadhead hits of 11,776. Again, full draw damage is just 2.4% less than that perfect draw, except when looking at Broadhead. Don't worry, we're gonna come back to that. Lastly though, the short draw damage here hits for 6,245 per body and 11,203 per crit, with only 573 damage for your Broadhead. Now in PvP against Guardians with 10 resilience, Wishender's perfect draw does 72 damage per body and 129 per crit. And again, the original trailer made Wishender look like it was going to be the most annoying bow in the game. Of course, Love Monarch has that on lockdown. The wall hacks though are nice. Now the Broadhead damage here only applies once, and with all three draw types, it's an extra 30 damage. That means the highest damage this can put out in a single shot is 159 on a perfect draw precision shot, which of course is not enough to one-shot kill. Now you're looking at roughly like a 1.6 TTK value if you were to start off with that first crit and then follow up with another shot. Most people don't use bows like that. Like you get the initial shot off and then you immediately swap to something else to get the cleanup. Look no further than my hunters with Lucky Pants. Now like I said, that is a lot of numbers to keep track of, and we actually did tons of more testing in other lost sectors, patrol spaces. We calculated crit multipliers and draw type damage ratios. We tried search mods. It's a lot, but everything we've mentioned so far gives us what we need to paint a detailed picture of and how this bow is performing. At a glance, it does look somewhat underwhelming. Why is the major crit DPS lower than that of something like Revision 0? Why is Broadhead's damage all over the place? Now compared to other kinetic slot bows, both lightweight and precision frames, Wishender again seems on paper like it's nothing special. Precision bows have slightly faster draw speed, with their kinetic variants dealing more damage, and have slightly higher crit values against majors, albeit less forgiving ratios for full draw and short draw damage. Lightweights only do slightly less damage, but with nearly identical draw type ratios and almost double the rate of fire. However, the thing that has plagued lightweights for so long is they just don't feel as good to shoot, and I do agree with that, although Bungie is trying to make changes multiple times to make them feel better. And when we look across the landscape of other bows, especially our exotics like La Monarch, TQ's Divination, Trinity Ghoul, the task that Wishender had of even competing against those bows was monumental. How could it? And when you look at Wishender's damage numbers at a glance, you would assume the damage is too low, but that, my friends, would be the wrong conclusion. Anybody that's used Wishender since its buffs back in Plunder knows that it is without a doubt one of the best weapons in Destiny 2 in-game. Honestly, the most surprising thing during this testing was that each individual result seemed underwhelming when the weapon itself feels so strong. And like any crown jewel, there are many carefully crafted angles that makes this a coveted beauty, and is truly more than the sum of its parts. The space in which this is most obvious is in Grandmaster Nightfalls, or similarly, difficult PvE activities. Wishender is a one-shot stun against all barrier champions on perfect and full draw shots. And until Revision 0's introduction the following season, it was the only other primary ammo weapon with intrinsic anti-barrier capabilities. And suddenly, Arbalest, which was the reigning king for so long, had competition. Now remember that Queen's Wrath only procs on perfect and full draws, so rushing your shots won't have any effects, so watch that hilt. Now Bungie's patch notes this update also stated that the number of hits against most targets was increased from 2 to 3, except against players, referring to the entry and exit damage. Broadhead's damage scales on a steep curve, with the draw of the arrow in PvE all the way up to 105% of a perfect draw crit. Even if you land a body shot, it still scales to 105% of the potential crits. So on top of instantly stunning champions with no ammo cost, it's now dealing more than triple damage. Now as if that wasn't enough, they also increased damage against champions, majors, and mini bosses by 10%. After years of lagging behind in PvE, Bungie overnight turned Wishender into a default option for your kinetic slots. So again, I say guys, especially for my new players, if you're scratching your head wondering what should I run, dude, in LFG environments, especially if you're dealing with barrier champions, Wishender. Now in PvP, things are a bit different, but not necessarily in a bad way. After reaching the perfect draw, an arrow can be held for roughly 3.5 seconds, giving players roughly 3.5 seconds of perfectly legal wall hacks. Now while precisely measuring distances in Destiny is notoriously difficult, you can see here that the true sight granted by Queen's Wrath toggles on and off at about 50 meters from Coral, which is also true in PvP. Even though it can't one-tap, it does give you the layout of your enemy, allowing you to communicate this to your teammates. And of course, if you have Oathkeepers, you can hold this 100% of the time. I know, it's the 97th most used weapon in Trials this past weekend. People are not necessarily jumping up and down to use Wishender in PvP, but there is a playstyle for it. And the few times I have gone up against someone using Wishender in PvP, I have been extremely annoyed. And there are a lot of other details to note about this weapon. Kinetic surge mods apply to every damage value equally, and that's important considering all the different damage values. And these are the different stacks that you can get with each surge mod. Void invisibility also disables Queen's Wrath True Sight. So if enemies can't see you, you can't see them, which I guess is kind of fair. Penetration damage generally doesn't apply to minor enemies unless they have shields. And we're not really sure whether that's because the base damage is enough to kill them before Broadhead actually applies, which it is, or because Bungie may have manually set the number of times Broadhead applies, as is implied in this 6.0.2 patch note. That can happen, but we've only spotted it when multiple targets are hit with the same shot. Again, on paper it sounds finicky and tough to use, but that's just not how it feels. So long as you fully draw your arrows, this thing will work like a dream. Now, all those numbers of traits and quirks may seem like a lot to handle, but in practice, they're all just reasons to why Wishender performs so well. True Sight, triple damage, high damage floor, shoot through enemies, practically infinite range. I know we have lots of competition out there in that same slot, especially amongst primary weapons. Quicksilver Storm, Outbreak Perfected, I love them. But this bow is not to be judged based on its DPS values. It's not something you're going to be dealing constant damage. It's that peak orientation, going in and out of cover and landing large amounts of damage every single time you do so. Now, I do want to focus up real quick on what is going to be changing with this weapon next season. More specifically, when combined with Oathkeepers. We covered the Season 21 exotic armor tunings, and Oathkeepers is looking extremely juicy. Essentially though, when fully drawn, bows will gain a bonus to damage against combatants that increases as you hold the draw, but deactivates after a few seconds. Now, considering Oathkeeper allows you to hold the draw indefinitely, you never have to worry about getting outside of that perfect draw window. We're really curious to know how long it's going to take to actually activate that damage buff, but you can imagine, considering Wishender's damage, how much more powerful it's about to become. And the other question I have is, how is this going to affect Leviathan's Breath? Think of it as like box breathing for your bow, but applicable here through these exotic gauntlets. Overall, guys, when it comes to dealing with barrier champions, Wishender, for me, is king. And then on top of that, a lot of people don't know that you're contributing to your super energy more because you're hitting enemies multiple times with Broadhead. Those multiple entry and exits actually can result in you getting your super back almost instantly. And we've actually seen gameplay of this for Orpheus Rig Hunters, who literally pop a tether, use Wishender, and within seconds, they have their super back. Hopefully, Bungie doesn't nerf this, and I don't think it needs a nerf. However, I think some people would say Arbalest also didn't need a nerf, and Bungie nerfed it twice. With that being said, guys, this is definitely an exotic worth having, so snag it when you can. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.